Hi, this is John Mason. Today we're going to talk about root movement and chord classification. Today we're going to look at the work of a French composer from the Baroque period called Jean-Philippe Rameau. Now before we start, I'd like to say that this is not an exhaustive theory course. None of these introductory lessons are. So if you want to get an exhaustive course on basic theory, I suggest that you look down below at the links I've provided in the description on this video, and hopefully you'll find something that'll help you to understand basic theory. So anyway, first we're going to talk about root movement. Now, Jean-Philippe Rameau was a music theorist, and he wanted to understand how to analyze the music of his contemporaries. So he would take the music of someone like J.S. Bach, and underneath the music of Bach, he would write his own staff with a bass clef on it. And on that bass clef, or on that staff, he would write the root of each chord below the chords in the music. And then he measured the distance between each successive root in that progression of chords using the staff that he had just written all the roots on. In the process, he discovered that there are only 4 kinds of root movement. There are chords who have their roots on the same note. So for example, C major followed by C major. That's called prime root movement, root by prime. And then there's what's called root by fifth. So for example, C major and G major are fifth apart. So are C major and F major. And then there's what's called root by second, which is when the roots of the chords are a second apart. So for example, C major and D major have their roots a second apart. And then G major and F major have their roots a second apart. Finally, we have what's called root by third, which is when the roots of the chords are a third apart. So for example, C major and E minor, or C major and A minor. Now, this is also true of, I just said that there are 4 kinds of root movement. There's prime, so this is prime. There's root by fifth. Then there's root by second. Then there's root by third. These kinds of root movement that I just mentioned, they also include their inversions. So root by prime also includes movement by octave. Root by fifth also includes movement by fourth. Root by second also includes movement by seventh. And root by third also includes movement by sixths. So those root movements that I just mentioned, they include their inversions, so don't forget that. Now, Rameau, as he studied root movement in the music of Bach and Handel and other people like that, he began to notice that root by fifth was the most common root movement, or tended to be. And he established that this is how you make keys. You establish them by taking you establish a major key by taking a major triad, like C major, and then putting 2 major triads a fifth above and a fifth below it. Now, if you do that with C major, and then put F major below that, and G major above it, a fifth above, if you were to play all those notes simultaneously, you would get all of the notes of the C major scale. That's what he means when he says that if you line up these chords, all these 3 chords a fifth apart, you get a major scale. You can do the same thing with them to get a minor scale. You just take 3 minor chords a fifth apart. So for example, C minor, F minor, and G minor, all in a row. If you take those chords, you play them simultaneously, you'll hear all the notes of C natural minor scale. Now, that's only the C natural minor scale that I'm talking about, the natural minor scale. If you want to form other forms of minor like harmonic or melodic, it's a little more complicated. But we're not going to talk about that in this lesson. So that's how he establishes keys, by root by fifth movement. Alright, now that we've looked at root movement, we're going to look at something called chord classification, which is a system that takes all the chords of the major and minor scales and categorizes them so that we can understand where they go, and it's a sort of musical roadmap, so to speak, for the music of Bach and his contemporaries. So let's start by reviewing the names of the chords of the major scale. So let's take C major as an example. So the tonic is C major, the supertonic is D minor, the mediant is E minor, the subdominant is F major, the dominant is G major, the submediant is A minor, the leading tone is B diminished, and the tonic is once again C major. So tonic, supertonic, mediant, subdominant, dominant, submediant, leading tone, tonic. Those are the names of the chords of the major scale. All right, now that we've reviewed the names of the chords of the scale, we're going to look at the system of chord classification that organizes all of them. So first we'll start with the tonic. So let's use the C major scale again. So in C major, the tonic is the C major triad. Now, in this system of organization of chords, let's think of the tonic as a sun or star that everything else revolves around, that all the other chords revolve around, or tend to revolve around, and tend to get pulled back towards. But not always, of course. There are exceptions to that rule. So first we have the tonic, C major, at the top of the chart. And then we have what are called the chords of the first classification. The first classification chords are the dominant, in this case G major, and the leading tone, in this case B diminished. Those chords, the chords of the first classification, are the ones that tend to lead right to the tonic. So this diminished chord, the B diminished, which is the leading tone chord, the scale, can lead directly to the tonic, or the dominant can. Next we have what's called the second classification, which has two chords in it, the subdominant and the supertonic. The subdominant in this case is F major, the supertonic is D minor. These are the chords of the second classification are the ones that tend to lead right to the chords of the first classification. Next we have what are called the chords of the third classification. There's only one, it's called the submediant, and that in this case is A minor. The submediant of the third classification tends to lead right to the chords of the second classification. So either the subdominant or the supertonic. And then finally we have what's called the fourth classification, which also only has one chord. It's called the mediant. This chord tends to lead to the third classification, submediant chord. So those are all the chords of all the classifications and the tonic. Now, what I've just described is the normal progression of chords. Now, there are two kinds of normal progression. First, there's progression from the tonic, in this case C major, to any other chord in the scale. So, if I throw any other chord in the scale out after the tonic, if I play any other chord after the tonic, that's considered normal. So, C major to G major is normal, C major to E minor is normal, etc. That's all considered normal. Now, the other kind of normal movement in this system is from one classification to another, one at a time, toward the tonic. So, say for example, we're in second classification on the subdominant, and we go to the first classification, so we go to the dominant, and then we go to the tonic. That's all considered normal because I went toward the tonic by degrees, one step at a time, one classification at a time. But there are three other kinds of progression in this system. First, there's normal progression. Then there's what's called repetition. Repetition is exactly what it sounds like it is. It's just, you're just repeating the same chord. So say, for example, I repeat the tonic. That's a repetition. Or if I repeat it here, or if I play it here and repeat it here, that's considered repetition. There's also one other kind of repetition that's less obvious. It's the repetition of the same classification. So, say for example, I'm in the first classification on the dominant, and I play the other chord from the first classification, which is the leading tone. Those two chords, if I play them one after another, that's considered a repetition because I'm repeating the same classification. Next we have what's called elision, which is when you're going toward the tonic, but you're not going by steps. You're not progressing normally from one classification to another toward the tonic. Instead, you skip at least one classification on your way back toward the tonic. So say, for example, we're in the second classification on the subdominant. Normally we would go to the first classification, usually the dominant, and then the tonic. And that's considered normal. But if I'm on the subdominant and I go directly from it to the tonic and skip the first classification, that's called an elision. Elisions don't just happen when you skip one classification on your way back to the tonic. They can happen when you skip more than one. So say, for example, we're on the fourth classification, mediant chord, like E minor in C major, and we go directly to G major, which is the dominant of C major. That is, when I do that, I'm skipping the third and second classifications on my way to the first classification. That's also considered an elision. Finally, we have what's called retrogression, and as its name suggests, it's when you go away from the tonic instead of toward the tonic as you progress through chords. So, say for example, we're on the dominant of C major, which is G major. Say we're on the dominant, which is in the first classification, and we go to the submediant, which is in the third classification. That is a retrogression. In fact, I picked this one because it's a pretty common retrogression. In fact, this one's called a deceptive cadence. This is the most common deceptive cadence in the music of Bach. So that is chord classification for you. So to wrap it up, if you only carry two things away from this video, I want you to remember that there are four kinds of root movement. There's prime, fifth, second, and third. And also, I'd like you to look at this chart of chord classification. Now, you don't need to memorize this all at once because, believe me, you will be using this chart all throughout the course. So you'll have plenty of time to memorize it, and we'll be using it to analyze all the music that we write and all the music that we look at. So don't worry about memorizing it all at once. We'll be using these tools, both root movement and chord classification, all throughout our study of the chorale style of J.S. Bach.